It's easy to overlook World War I. Overshadowed by the even deadlier Second World War, the so-called Great War killed some 40 million people, toppled empires, and redrew the map of Europe. But ultimately, the fighting ended not with Germany's triumph, but its defeat. The German Empire was forced to sign away territory, accept blame for the war, and pay reparations, ceding colonies, land, and even some of its own military to victors who had been humiliated just years prior. But what if the Germans had emerged victorious instead? How would our present look if the Central Powers had won? Stay tuned to find out. Now, although the outcome we're all familiar with, in which Germany loses and signs the infamous Treaty of Versailles, isn't up for debate, the details surrounding it are. And Germany actually came close to winning World War I on multiple occasions. In fact, there were 3 ways that Germany and its allies could have reasonably won the war. Firstly, there was the Schlieffen Plan, which outlined the German Empire as an initial plan for a quick strike through neutral Belgium before France could mobilize its forces. Although the strategy required Germany to invade Belgium, violating Belgian neutrality and international law, it was still seen as necessary to win the war as Germany was heavily outnumbered. In fact, the plan almost worked, too. And despite public outcry at the time, it wasn't until 2 months into the invasion that British politicians and the public decided to declare war on Germany. Secondly, Germany's use of submarines to cut off supplies reaching Britain proved effective and almost forced Britain into surrendering. And thirdly, Germany's final major push in 1918 to break through Allied lines was successful, until American intervention changed the tide of the war. In fact, the offensive actually did succeed in capturing Paris too, if only temporarily. So, let us assume in this alternate timeline that one of these offensives succeeded and that Germany had a chance to end the war before. American involvement made a difference. The result, Germany and its allies dictate the terms of peace. But what would those peace terms look like? Well, in our reality, the Treaty of Versailles was undeniably harsh on Germany. Not only did it make Germany give up territory, resources, and even demilitarize some areas, it also blamed the German Empire for causing the war and forced them to pay reparations, both of which served to humiliate Germany. But what if the peace treaty was dictated by Germany instead? Let's examine what each country would likely demand. For starters, France, which bore the brunt of the fighting and had seen its territory occupied, would likely be forced to cede border territories and possibly even more than just Alsace-Lorraine back to Germany. While defeated, France might also be crippled militarily, perhaps similar to the disarmament provisions placed on Germany in Versailles. And although Britain probably wouldn't lose its navy and empire, it would lose much of its influence in continental Europe. Meanwhile, Russia, which was already in the midst of its own revolution, might be forced to cede territories in the east, perhaps in Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, and parts of Ukraine. And although the Ottomans would probably be allowed to keep their territorial holdings, they would be forced to align themselves closely to Germany, essentially becoming a German protectorate. But what would this new world look like? Well, immediately, the United States would not enter the conflict. Without the events that triggered American entry into the war, such as the sinking of the Lusitania or the Zimmermann telegram, Washington might stay out of Europe's affairs, allowing Britain to keep more of its empire for longer. It would also lead to America emerging as a wealthy but peripheral power instead of the global leader it became in our reality. In fact, it might delay America's rise as a superpower by decades. The peace treaties would also be drastically different. Instead of facing harsh territorial losses and war guilt, Germany would be victorious, ending any nationalist grievances that would later give rise to extremist groups like the Nazis. As such, the entire premise of World War II would never take place, which would mean no Holocaust, no nuking of Japan, and no nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But what about the Cold War? Would Germany winning World War I change the nature of this conflict? Well, while it's true that it would avert World War II, it would not necessarily prevent a new global conflict because if Germany won World War I, it would emerge as the dominant power in Europe. This would cause resentment and fear in nations like Britain and the United States, which would form a new alliance to counter Germany. But unlike our present where the USA and its allies battle the USSR and its allies, this conflict would pit democratic powers against an authoritarian one, meaning a German-led bloc against the democracies. As such, we might be living in a very different Cold War today where the threat of mutually assured destruction doesn't exist, but where a conventional war on the European continent could have easily broken out. Ultimately, we can't say for sure whether a German victory would have prevented a new world war, but it certainly would have made it look very different. For instance, Europe would be dominated by the German Empire, meaning no European Union, no NATO, and no Council of Europe. And instead of a cooperative Europe, we might have an authoritarian one. In fact, colonialism might continue for much longer in this alternate world as Germany, Italy, and Japan would have little incentive to end their empires. They would also have little reason to grant independence to their colonies as no Western democracies would be around to challenge them. As such, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East might still be divided among these nations into the 21st century. But how else would our present be altered? Well, technology might be delayed by decades as the Second World War spurred advancements in aviation, computing, and weapons that were applied to civilian technologies afterwards. Without World War II, we might not have had jet engines until the 1960s or personal computers until the 1980s. The United States would also be different. Not only would it have a weaker claim to global leadership, but it would also be a significantly poor nation. After all, American involvement in World War I helped position the United States as a global powerhouse. Finally, the British Empire would probably survive longer too, although weakened and probably more dependent on Germany than versa. So, in conclusion, while Germany winning World War I would prevent some negative outcomes like the Holocaust or World War II, it would also come with many others. We might be living in an authoritarian Europe today ruled over by a German empire. Colonialism would probably continue. America wouldn't be a superpower, and the Cold War would look very different. Now, you'll have to decide for yourself whether a German victory would have been better or worse for humanity. Thanks for watching.